Okay. Sean?
Yes. Ready to begin?
Yes.
Oh, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us on this lovely evening here close to Christmas time. I hope everybody's staying safe and sound and with their loved ones. My name is Sean Farrow. I'm the moderator for tonight's event. Tonight's event is Hidden Figures, how New York City uses artificial intelligence to make decisions about human welfare. We're very fortunate enough to have two different panelists join us tonight. First is Khadija Abdul-Rahim. Khadija is a child welfare system abolitionist and an independent researcher whose focus is predictive analytics in the child welfare system. She is the co-founder of Word to RI, an oral history archive of racial justice and gentrification on Roosevelt Island. And she is also the director of We Be Imagining, a series of digital programming examining race and technology through infusing academic discourse with the performance arts in partnership with community-based organizations in collaboration with Columbia University's Entice Center and the American Assembly's Democracy and Trust Program, and is a visiting researcher and lecturer at Cornell Tech in the Millicene program. Additionally, we have Judge Melissa Crane. Judge Crane is a New York City civil court judge with experience in criminal court. Judge Crane is known for being a thoughtful judge handling commercial litigation cases and delivering fair and even-handed rulings. And our third panelist that just joined us here is Kevin Way. Kevin Way is a graduate student in computer science at Georgia Institute of Technology. His research interests include bias and fairness in machine learning and artificial intelligence, content regulation on the internet, and the social impacts of technology. In addition to his academic work, Kevin is an activist based here in New York City. I want to thank all three of you for joining us this evening, and we'll kick it off with Judge Crane. Judge Crane, if you don't mind leading us off, tell us what are algorithms and why are we here to learn all about them? You're on mute, Judge Crane.
I'm muted. I always do that. Sorry. So I just a little disclaimer. You don't usually see sitting judges at forums hosted by political clubs, but I'm able to do this because West Harlem Dems was so very helpful to me in getting me elected to Supreme for starting next year. And I am so grateful. And there's not a lot of ways of thanking people these days because we're all socially distanced. So this is my way of thanking. And I really appreciate everything everyone did for me and helping me. It's very important and I appreciate it. Anyway, what is an algorithm? So an algorithm is a step-by-step solution. So, and each step has clear instructions. So a good non-computer example is actually a cooking recipe. If you follow each step, you get an apple pie. Another example would be long division. You follow the steps, you get the answer. So basically an algorithm in terms of computers, you tell a computer how to do something. And a predictive algorithm uses historical data to calculate the probability of a future event. And that's really what we're going to be talking about here.
Thank you, Judge Crane. I'm going to turn to now Ms. Abdul-Rahim. You've had a great focus in this area here. What else can you tell us about the impact of algorithms in the different spheres that we see them used in?
I guess that I would just add that it's important. I think that the reason why I'm on this side of the panel in comparison to the audience is because a lot of work that happens in technology is obscured to the broader public. And 99% of what you need to know to understand the social impact of artificial intelligence and machine learning are things that are not at all technical. And I would just add that algorithms and AI, as they are implemented, I think are best understood as socio-technical systems. So it's moving the decision-making or the decision point from the frontline caseworker in child welfare or from the criminal court judge to the technologist, who's then encoding a set of values and decisions into this system. And so it's just important to know that, like, while some people might articulate it as a question of trying to mitigate bias and harm by making the decision-making more objective, that it's really just moving the decision point to a different domain instead of people.
And by moving this domain from the people to the technology now, what impact do you see it having on our world today?
Well, I was, in fairness, I'm like very late to respond to email. So I had prepared more of a talk than like just one answer, but maybe
Sure.
the most helpful thing that I could point to is I guess like the two canonical examples in the field, or one in child welfare, looking at Allegheny, Pennsylvania, which was the pilot model for predictive analytics in child welfare. And so what that meant was that instead of the frontline caseworker deciding whether or not a child should be removed, they had this automated decision-making system vis-a-vis a call center that on a variety of risk factors and data inputted would decide whether a child was at high risk for parental abuse. Some of the inputs that were put into that system would be, for example, race of the father. Does the mother have previous child welfare history? Is it a single parent? And it's important, like the part that's very important here is not necessarily technical, but a lot of what we're seeing is modifications and MOUs, or memorandums of understanding. So how does the system know prior to a call being placed that a child is in a family with a single parent? Is that they're modifying the memorandum of understanding between that regional's Department of Child Protective Services, or whatever it's called, and the Department of Health and Mental Health and Hygiene that says the vital statistics and the birth certificates. So it's able, through getting access to those kind of data sets, to put in a classifier into that algorithm that's saying, to weight this particular piece of information a certain way. And so the technologist is making a decision when he's not designing this algorithm, what are those classifiers? How will they be weighed? And then for the harm side, a parent is now having in that case, could have their child just immediately removed even prior to a court order, or at the very least having an investigation that's initiated, which my friend Joyce McMillan, who introduced me to you guys, is like very articulate about, and that we really need support, not surveillance. And, there's a lot of harm that's initiated once the investigation occurs.
That's excellent, and very appreciative to hear more about that. So if you could just take a step back and give us a brief overview of AI ethics field and discuss a little bit about the predictive analytics that you had talked to me about and you just kind of highlighted on. What is it that we should know at the community at large, and what steps should we take to addressing these issues?
So it's funny, I sent you prior to this event a list of resources, and I realized I just added it like a few minutes ago. But I wrote a piece about 2 weeks ago called The Moral Collapse of AI Ethics. And because a lot of, there's a phrase that says, artists are very dangerous because they mix with people of all classes. And while I'm not necessarily an artist, I do really, I'm both somebody who's like outside with Joyce demanding that we abolish the family regulation system in ACS. And I'm working with people who are in a policy space saying that they're demanding a stronger regulatory space for these proprietary or commercial algorithms. I'm with academics who are looking at the social impact as it relates to disability or race, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a big high profile firing of a woman who's also a friend of mine, Timna Gebru, whose position was AI ethics at Google. And this happened very publicly on Twitter. And there was a huge public response. And it's just funny, the power of Twitter. Like even Washington Post is reporting, like, this is what somebody said on Twitter. And what concerned me is that the conversation very quickly coalesced around just a question of racial bias. And we hear that a lot too, algorithmic bias. And how we define the scope of the solution correlates to how we define the what's central in the problem. And is the problem with Google that it's just a toxic work culture for Black people? Or is the problem that these computational structures, which are developed by corporations like Google and have infiltrated every aspect of our lives, are inherently toxic, unregulated, and like have operational incentives to take our data and make the majority of their revenue. Like I think with Google, about 71% of all revenue comes from ads. So is the problem that we just need to diversify that? Or is the problem that we need to fundamentally relook at our social contract, which has allowed these private companies to infiltrate all of our decision-making? And so I'm deeply, deeply concerned at the state of AI ethics because Silicon Valley cannot regulate itself. just as we would say, like police officers and like policing agencies cannot regulate itself. And so what I would like to say to the community is that I think this is a really important juncture to open up the conversation. And I hope that there can be some terminology and some ways that these systems operate that might feel like, a learning curve or feel confusing. But really what on your everyday daily basis of experiencing being like, Black walking through Harlem, getting stopped and frisked, or having a child welfare investigation or going through a credit check. A lot of that will tell you exactly what you need to know. And then the very last thing that I will say is that, my concern is that this notion of fairness, accountability, and transparency assumes that we can modify these algorithms without ever taking into account that these systems shouldn't exist in the first place. And that this prediction and classification are at the very bedrock of racial capitalism. And the most important technologies are kind of like the spreadsheet. And so right when we see enslaved people step off the ship onto this new America, their facial features and various characteristics are being placed into a ledger. And there's being a value calculation there. And there's a line that we can draw from 450 years ago, and we're looking at enslavement and classification and predicting who will be the best worker, predicting who will be a problem, to the way in which we're seeing these algorithms and these like emergent automated technologies being implemented, whether it's in child welfare, criminal justice system, or how, coordinated housing entry, Medicaid. Yeah, so that was a lot, but I hope that was clarified. And I have a cold, I'm sorry.
And I hope you feel better. Thank you. I'm going to briefly turn to Kevin, kind of piggyback off of that. Ms. Abdul Raham talked about the fact that you see racial biases make their way or come to the surface in different other spheres, such as child welfare. Kevin, can you touch upon the different aspects of life in which we see racial biases kind of play out?
That's a really broad question. My interest really lies in automated decision systems and sort of agency or executive administration use cases. I think that, right now, a lot of these use cases are not very transparent to the public because organizations don't have any incentive or requirement to report on how these systems are being used, what is going into these systems, around the racial impact of these systems. So, like the Compass algorithm was used for years, and nobody reported on this until ProPublica came out with this article in 2016, a couple of years ago, that indicated that like this algorithm is massively biased, right? But nobody had really the incentive to look into this or to police this on that publicly before that happened. And sort of the same thing I think is happening in a lot of other public agencies across the United States. Like the Pennsylvania system that was just mentioned, I think is a particularly good example. There are also systems in Los Angeles that the city is using to distribute resources to individuals experiencing homelessness that are racially biased. There are systems in the Social Security Administration that are used to determine whose cases are heard first, to determine who gets disability insurance. Those systems, have not been comprehensively audited, and I would suspect are likely biased as well. And there's just a whole host of these use cases where these algorithms are being used, they're not being audited or overseen, and very likely a lot of bias is happening and slipping through the cracks. And the impact of that is very real. I think that you see individuals and families who are in need who would be, for instance, denied aid or are barred access to resources or are put in jail as a direct result of the use of these algorithms.
So I want to ask this question. If the idea behind the use of these algorithms is to eliminate biases, why do we see so much of it still? And why does it seem like we're not able to or haven't been able to address that yet?
Well, I don't know if the question is to me or to the panel as a whole, but I think I would start with saying that I don't think the intent of these algorithms is to eliminate biases. I think that is maybe a talking point that comes up, and maybe there is definitely research about how we can use algorithms to eliminate bias. But I would suspect that the use cases in the corporate world is to increase, quote unquote, increase efficiency for their work processes, yada, 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 and to to automate some of these processes, and as a result, cut their labor force. And I don't think the intent is really to eliminate racial bias.
Sure. And just to give you one more question, if the intent is not to create biases, then how is it created? What is causing the fact that these biases still exist and still harming people, especially people of color?
Right. So there are, about 100 different answers to this. I think maybe one of the most common sources of bias is probably just in historical data sets that are being used to train these algorithms. So sort of a little background and context about how these algorithms are developed. Like you take a large data set, right? So you have like a data set and it's got a bunch of information about people, and maybe it has information about like their gender, their address, or whatever. And all of that data is then fed into this algorithm, and the algorithm looks at that and tries to find patterns essentially in the data, and uses that to spit out like a score or prediction or some sort of determination about an individual or about a family or a particular case. And a lot of the times the data that is being used, for instance, might not have data points about of communities of color. So that data might itself be biased. There might be definitions in the algorithm that are biased. So to make this a little more concrete, I think one example is Amazon, I think in 2015, announced that it had developed and then essentially, immediately retired an algorithm that it was using to score job applicants for software engineering positions. And what it had discovered was that it had used essentially the data set that was used to train this algorithm was 10 years of job applications that were sent to Amazon. And what it found was that training an algorithm and developing software based off of that data set actually resulted in women being discriminated against by the algorithm, because historically women have been barred access to fields like computer science. And when you use that data to train just sort of naively an algorithm based on that, and what you come up with is an algorithm that looks at that data and says, well, most of these applicants and successful applicants are not women, so women must therefore not be good at computer science, which we know is not the case, right? But that's an example of that happening, and reason for that happening is, I think, fairly straightforward in that case.
Excellent.
Oh,
sure, please.
Well, one thing that I just wanted to add is that I'm very familiar with this like garbage in, garbage out thesis, saying that like, okay, if we're doing predictive policing, but the frontline like police officers, will largely accept based on like the public conversation around the prison industrial complex are, racially motivated to interact and engage with Black communities more than white communities. And therefore there'll be this overrepresentation of Black people in the data sets, which will then be reflected in its insights. But I mean, being around a lot of the AI ethics community and like meaning that broadly, so like technologists, policy people, all of that, right? I think that there's also like an alleviation of accountability in that explanation of saying, hey, these working class people over here, they're not doing it right. We're more progressive, so we're better able to create the socio-technical system that will then mitigate that bias. And like to understand why are these algorithms continuously reproducing and then exacerbating social inequality, you got to look at the social context in which the algorithms are implemented. So automating inequality, how digital tools police, punish, and surveil the poor, I believe is by Virginia Eubanks. It's one of the like best books looking at automated decision-making systems in 3 sectors. She's looking at Allegheny, and then she's also looking at coordinated housing entry in LA. And then I think the second example is Medicaid systems in Indiana. And so the thing that she highlights is one that is happening in the background of austerity. So optimization and efficiency in and of itself are not necessarily harmful, but we're talking about a transition of the role of the state. And this is Dorothy Roberts writes a review of automating equality, where she highlights prediction and classification are like central to racial capitalism and to social control of Black people. But the particular thing, say with child welfare, is that we start to see child welfare be a much more punitive social apparatus at the time where Black women are fighting for inclusion into AFDC for these welfare benefits. And so now we're like 20 years past, Clinton ending welfare as we know it. And that's the context in which we're seeing these algorithms being implemented to optimize, to have the least amount of resources to impact and control like the largest cohort of people. And so I think while like the garbage in, garbage out point is important, that I think that the broader picture is that, ultimately what was the intent behind these technologies, and not the individual being a good or a bad person, but like what were these systems actually designed to do? And if they were designed to decimate families, or if they're predicting whether somebody's going to commit a crime, you're only going to get an answer that says whether someone is going to commit a crime. If the question is who is most likely to graduate, you're going to build up a system that allows people to graduate and highlights and identifies and shifts resources to people who are going to graduate. But that's not what these systems are designed to do.
So that brings me to a good question, right? These systems are designed, it seems, in part to hurt people, right? The intention behind it is to help people, but obviously that's not the way they've been implemented. And so far, these systems have been designed to sit there and hurt people of color, marginalized people. So how do we switch it into where we can get the intent of these different arenas, these different algorithm systems to benefit people? And I'll start with Ms. Abdulrahim. What are the solutions that we can start working towards?
I feel bad because I feel like I talk the most. But as far as specific solutions, I mean, I do I'm an extremely opinionated person, and I might have a set of like particular demands, like, for example, abolishing the New York City Administration of Children's Services because it was only created to control, decimate, and surveil Black families. But I really suggest, I dropped a link in the chat for a list of resources that include things that I've created, but also a variety of like grassroots organizations, some news articles, including the piece on machine bias and ProPublica that Kevin had referenced. And I just really suggest that people start educating themselves so they feel like they could be on this side of the panel, because then what the demands look like, a huge percentage of the demand is the right to refuse. And to say that I, as somebody with developmental disability, should be able to get a Medicaid waiver without having all of my information held on this proprietary data platform that's making predictive insights. I just happen to know because I have kids with Medicaid waivers that I was like almost coerced into signing this form that was doing these things. And so a lot of it is just banal like that. And so it seems like, you're signing up for your food stamps, and it seems a little convenient because now you don't got to deal with the worker, you don't got to go into the office. But in reality, like, what is facilitating that convenience? And so when you educate yourself, then you're able to make a set of demands. And one concrete example I'll give is that in that piece that I discussed with Timne Gebru, I'm Ethiopian. And so I didn't realize until 40,000 refugees had fled a few weeks ago from Ethiopia into across the border of southern Sudan, that the UNHCR is the largest biometric program in the world. And so it's doing biometrics, meaning like iris scans, fingerprint scans. Like, think about it, even seems cool sometimes, right? Your iPhone, you can put your thumbprint in there now. And they're putting them into these large databases. The Department of Homeland Security in the United States has already come to an understanding with UNHCR that they can have access to this data, like scary stuff, right? But when this was implemented in Myanmar, the Rohingya, who were experiencing genocide from the military, fought against, imagine, in a war zone where they're like also fleeing with nothing but the clothes on their backs, organized a protest in the refugee camp and said, we will not allow you to take our data. We will not allow you to scan our eyes. And it's important to look at that because the UNHCR, on the flip side, Philip Alston, the special rapporteur to the United States, wrote a report in 2018 about human rights abuses in the United States, and was saying that, look, I'm flagging this issue with predictive analytics because they experiment on the most marginalized before they generalize it to the rest of society. So we should be looking at what's happening to refugees to highlight that this is not here yet. That's not your interaction when you're going to go get food stamps in Harlem right now, but that can be what's happening. And two, let's look at the people who are fighting back. And if you understand this in the way that we're like articulating here on the panel, you're in a position as an individual, as a community, you're building your neighbors, your family, to then articulate a set of demands and fight back and build a resistance.
Judge Green, turning to you very briefly here. Uh, Ms. Abdulrahim talked about predictive analytics, right? We see that used in the criminal sphere often in times of police technology such as Patternizer, right? Patternizer, for those that don't know, is technology used by the NYPD where they predict hotbeds of activity in certain communities. If a community is over policed, then obviously we're going to see a hotbed of activity. And so it kind of keeps this cycle going used by the police. And something that Kevin talked about was algorithms being used to score job applicants. We see that also in the criminal sphere, where algorithms are used to score someone's risk of flight and bail. My question to you is, as lawyers, as people who deal with the arguments and the legal side of things, what could we do to kind of push back against the use of these algorithms and make it a more fair and equitable system?
Okay, so because I'm a sitting judge, I'm somewhat circumscribed in answering that question because I'm not permitted to give out legal advice. But I can tell you what the law is thus far. It's just starting, and it's interesting. So the most widely used in the criminal context, and I believe in New York, is the Compass software from North Point. And Compass stands for Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions, actually. And initially it was used to provide decisional support to corrections departments and parole officers and the like, but it's now used by courts in sentencing and setting bail. And how does it work? It compares a particular defendant's answers to questions and personal factors against a nationwide data group, and then it comes up with a score. And the higher the score, the greatest risk of recidivism or flight. And as I think Kevin touched on, no one knows how Compass weighs the risk factors or determines the scores because North Point claims that the algorithm is proprietary. I mean, the general guide does explain that scores are based largely on static information like criminal history, and then adds in variables that are more fluctuating like drug use or social acquaintances. And a lot of the information is verifiable on social media or rap sheets. And New York State actually did a validation study on Compass and found that it was 71% accurate in predicting recidivism. But the New York State study didn't account for race. And someone else, I think, alluded to the ProPublica study. That was a report that ProPublica did in May of 2016, and they analyzed data and things that were happening in Broward County, Florida, which is where, as you know, Fort Lauderdale is, Deerfield Beach. And these are urban communities like ours. And it found that when it came to race, the results of the algorithm were much less accurate. For example, the software labeled higher risk for reoffending, only 23.5% of whites did not reoffend, or 76% did reoffend. So this means the program was about 76% accurate as to white defendants labeled high risk. However, the African Americans in the group, 44.9% did not reoffend, and that means the software was far less accurate. It was about 55% accurate when it came to African American defendants, and was therefore over labeling African American defendants as high risk, at least when compared with the white defendants. And the same thing kind of happened in converse with labeling for lower risk. So when you couple this with a circumstance that the police might use algorithms to predict, where the crime is occurring and or is going to be, and then the police go to those locations, we're kind of in a loop that creates its own reality. And so there's been a few decisions that have addressed this, not many, but a few. And the first is, and I'm going to just talk about two of them so we don't get too into it, because I know we don't have a lot of time, but so I'm going to stick with the high court decisions. And the first is People v. Loomis. It's the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and that is the highest court thus far to address the Compass algorithm. And in that case, there was a drive-by shooting, And Mr. Loomis was accused of being the driver, and he was charged with 5 counts, and the top count was first-degree reckless endangerment, and he pled down to 2 counts, and took a plea, and for some reason the sentencing was left up to the judge, and the Compass risk assessment labeled him high risk of reoffending, and the judge sentenced him to the maximum 6 years incarceration and 5 years probation. And then there was another hearing at which Mr. Loomis presented expert testimony about Compass's limitations, including that no one knows about what's in the algorithm because it's proprietary. The Supreme Court of Wisconsin did uphold the sentence, largely because it felt that, although it did recognize that nothing explains exactly how the Compass program works, but that because Mr. Loomis had access to his own information, and because the sentencing court said that they would have done the same sentence regardless of Compass, they upheld the sentence. So that was the first court to even, or the highest court to even recognize that the limitations on the Compass algorithm. But it, at the same time, and this is, it gave a list of factors that the sentencing court should use, certain issues and procedural safeguards. And this is, I think, where the decision made an important contribution to the law. So the first is that the sentencing court must be informed that it's not known how Compass weighs the risk factors or determines scores, because that information is a trade secret. Second, the sentencing court must be made aware that the comparison data used by Compass is national data, not just by jurisdiction. And we can talk about that more in a minute. And the sentencing court also must be made aware that there are studies that question, like the ProPublica study, whether the Compass program unfairly weighs race in scoring. And that Compass must be constantly updated for accuracy due to changing demographics. So that's the first case. And one issue that that another court went into, it's the state of Iowa v. Guys from 2018. The factor of it's a nationwide data set against an individual, right? That can be a real problem. And in state of Iowa v. Guys, the concurrence raised the concern that we don't know whether the tool was normed with an appropriate Iowa population. And you could see that being a concern in New York City, because in New York, we're using software to inform bail decisions. And if I would assume, we don't know because everything's proprietary, but I would assume homelessness is not a good factor in the algorithm, right? But in New York, and particularly New York City, you could be homeless and have a phone and a job, and you might be very likely to come back to court. But your score is going to be bad because you can't afford to live anywhere. So compared to actually Iowa, where it's probably, I may be being a little New York centric, but it's much cheaper to live there, I would assume. So that maybe being homeless in Iowa means more than it does here. So there's a lot of issues. And then, I'll stop talking, I'm sorry to go on, but the Iowa court also raised the issue that what happens, so when you sentence a defendant, you can't use non-conviction crimes. So you can't use the arrest crime, you can't use crimes that have been dropped. But if the algorithm is using them, then doesn't it come in by the back door? So these are all sorts of issues that the courts are raising. And I expect more. It should snowball because it's really picking up.
And just to piggyback off, with the snowball effect of more of these cases being challenged, what do you see the trend being in New York? Or what do you think New York lawyers might be looking to do in the future to push back against these?
Well, again, I can't really give out legal advice, but, I mean, whatever, I would just make sure you have all the law at your fingertips when you talk to the court.
Thank you for that. Kevin, you had suggested in one of your papers I read from the Day One Project that there should be a plan of action in place to kind of push back against these algorithms. Can you talk a little bit briefly about your plan of action, one of which
Sure.
suggested that there should be a mandatory notice and comment process?
So, I mean, I think sort of from a bird's eye view sort of level of looking at this, maybe like when we look at regulating this sort of technology, one of the first barriers is that none of this is transparent. We don't know what's happening. We don't know the racial impact of these systems. Many times we don't even know if these systems are being in use. And the people, especially whose lives are being affected by these systems. So think about somebody who goes into the Social Security Administration with a disability insurance case. Like that person does not know if an algorithm was used to determine the priority of their case in the hearing of that case on the docket in front of the SSA. Like they do not know. And I think that there are very, very many cases of or examples of this happening where these systems are in use, especially sort of in the corporate sector, and the people whose lives are impacted by this just don't know that is happening. I think so shedding some light on when these systems are being used, what exactly is going into these systems, on the impact of these systems, is an option for a first step in trying to regulate these systems. So one example of where this has been done is in Canada. So last year they have implemented a new policy around automated decision systems, where in governmental use cases in Canada, they are now required to disclose that these systems are in use, and they're required to allow the public to comment on these on the systems themselves, and a host of other items. There have also been some bills around this in California and Washington around regulating the use of algorithmic systems in sort of these corporate use cases. And I think those are all good places to look to start looking when we look at regulating this. In addition to perhaps banning some of the systems that we are currently using, like facial recognition and sort of these law enforcement contexts.
You're muted.
Sean, we can't hear you.
Before we get to Judge Crane, sorry about that, everyone.
Well, I just, while we're on the same topic, I just wanted, the New York Times has reported that Idaho passed a law specifying that the methods and data used in bail algorithms must be publicly available so people can understand them. Just
great point.
Sean, can I
Appreciate
just add one thing?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Do you mind if I add one thing? I'm gonna throw off your.
Please, yeah, go for it. That's what we're here for.
Thank you. The one thing that I wanted to add that I think may be helpful for people to understand about the Allegheny example is that I put in that Google Doc, the PBS NewsHour special, and it gives you an image of I think the first 13 or 10 classifiers that they were using. But it would say, like, does mother have mental illness? Is there food insecurity? Are they homeless? It does not know whether this person has a mental health history. It's looking at, did this person use their Medicaid to go to a Medicaid mental health clinic? It does not know whether or not there's food in the fridge per se. It's looking to see, does this person have food stamps? And so when we're talking about making predictions, talking about predictive analytics, there's one level of the algorithm auditing, blah, 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 but you can only be predicted, or you can only interact with this if you're in the data set. And when we're talking about the public sector, you're most likely to be in the data set if you're interacting with these like state subsidies on this level, right? Because I mean, the people getting farm subsidies are not probably in the data set. And then I would say, like on the non like poor people example, is that even when I'm interacting with people in Google, and this is my frustration with the conversation about diversity and equity around TIMNIT, a lot of people just actually have no idea what does Google do. So beyond G Suite, like your Gmail, your Google Docs, and then, search, right? Like what else is Google doing? How do these large language models operate? What is the like computational structures, blah, blah, blah. And so the example that I want to give, if you're using Google Maps right now, you might notice that if you're looking at say 125th Street in Lenox, it will tell you that it's busy at this particular time. And even for people that are technically, that are like working in these systems, a lot of people don't know which are the data sets that are being entered into Google's system, which is delivering this insight to you that's saying it's busy. So there's all the public sector stuff, but I really want to direct people to one of the best tools in here has nothing to do with me, is our data bodies put together a digital defense playbook to help people think through the ways in which they're giving over their data to, like, at a point of sale, as they're walking through smart cities, as their kid is entering different, echelons of school, et cetera, because this is so much bigger. And then the very last thing I just wanted to say, that kind of echoing what Judge Crane said, is that we're also looking at a transition from, is this individual person likely to abuse their child? Is this individual person likely to not comply with their parole? Are people like this likely to do something? So all of this information that's entering in is not so much interested in the individual, is interested in creating an algorithm and like drawing together a data set that's looking at population or cohort level decision making, which removes a level of agency. So even if you might have negative interactions with an individual police officer right now and might not feel like they will be fair in their determining of your innocence or guilt, you're at least dealing with yourself as an individual. So the algorithms and like this automation is trying to push us towards looking at things on the level of population level. Which populations are most likely to be homeless versus will this individual person be?
And that's a great point that you just brought up there. And we see it oftentimes in the criminal sphere. I keep referring to that because that's where I practice as a criminal defense attorney with legal aid. One question I'm going to open up to all the panelists here. So what can we do as ordinary citizens, as a community, to kind of push our government to disclose what algorithms are used and who's coming up with these algorithms and what are going into these algorithms? I'm going to start with Judge Crane. If you have any idea as to what we can do as ordinary citizens.
Yeah, I'm going to take a pass on that because I shouldn't be speaking about that.
Sure.
Sorry.
Ms. Abdul Rahim, that's quite all right. What do you think we can do as ordinary citizens?
I mean, one thing that I'll point to is that New York City was the very first place in the country to have an automated decision-making task force that was comprised of both people with technical expertise and representatives of various marginalized communities. Like, I can't remember everyone's names, but like the head of RISE to represent around child welfare, the head of the Fortune Society, in a lot of ways represented kind of like our best aspiration around civic governance and accountability. However, they only consulted with that kind of community coalition once, and a huge opportunity was missed. And AI Now, there was a paper by a civil rights attorney who's now left, that was the head of their policy department, Rashida Richardson. The name of the report is something like the Shadow Report on Black Box Automated Decision-Making Systems. And her conclusion was like, first of all, the report that they generated largely had their bios. And it was really like this kind of like a prestigious opportunity that really didn't bring to fore any particular like regulatory demand. It didn't communicate anything to the communities about how these automated decision-making systems operate, and just like really thinking through how we can start to create new kinds of institutions and coalitions that know how to articulate the proper demands. Because what I see from an academic angle is that I no longer live in Rose Island. When I lived there was a new Cornell Graduate Technical University. And when people would interact with the human computer interaction department or technologists, the biggest thing that people ask for is websites. And the biggest thing people are afraid of is that robots are going to take over their job. And largely people are not educated to know from their life experience and their professional experience how to articulate what are the particular set of policy, technical, regulatory demands to make. And so that's why I would just like really encourage people to kind of dig in and educate, because the battle is here. And there's kind of like, there's serious, grave concerns about how this will ultimately just, and is automating injustice.
Thank you for that. And Kevin, I'll turn to you. What do you think, if anything, that we can do as a community in order to push back against the use of algorithms and kind of lessen the biases that we see?
Right. So I think one of the first steps has to be public education and awareness around these algorithms and the racial inequities and economic inequities that they're perpetuating. And, to some extent, I think the onus is on the government and legislators to act, because a lot of this problem, we really need legislation around, but sort of on an individual level. I mean, a lot of this, we can obviously do a lot of advocacy around these systems and around making certain asks of our legislators to regulate these systems.
Awesome. If anybody has any other questions, please feel free. I'm probably going to just end on this question here. And again, I'll open this up to all the panelists here. Where do we see things going in the next 10 years with algorithms? Do we see that we can try to change the objective of these net algorithms and make it more positive and actually go towards the path that we intended them to be? Or do we see things kind of continue the way it is until something drastic changes? Judge Crane, what do you think?
Well, my concern has always been that the law keeps up with technology, right? So that's how I got interested in this area, and then discovered all these, problems have been pointed out. So I would like to see that continue, and more stuff from the courts like Loomis and Guys, and more as the case law develops. And eventually, like in Idaho, I'm sure there'll be more legislation on it, and legislation for the courts to interpret.
If I could just briefly ask, the decision that you read or spoke of in Loomis, do you think that that was decided right?
Hopefully it's not on a. I'll just tell you, I'll limit it to saying I think that there are factors. I think that they're important, the factors they highlighted, and remember, this is the Supreme Court of Wisconsin. It's not some fly-by-night low-level court. This is a court speaking, a very formidable court speaking. And so I think the factors they laid out is the big takeaway from that decision. And anyway, that I'll leave it at that. It's hard. I am somewhat circumscribed in how I'm able to respond to your questions.
But I do appreciate it, and I thank you for answering it the best that you can. Ms. Abdul Rahim, where do you see the future of this going? And are you optimistic or not? My apologies.
I waffle between optimism and despair. I think that if we look at the status quo, I think we're kind of doomed. The status quo right now is that the law is not keeping up with the technologies. The status quo is that corporate monopolies are largely determining the social contract. The status quo is that people are having their data and becoming disciplined subjects to the point that they're having their eyeballs scanned to purchase groceries after fleeing a war-torn conflict in a refugee camp. On the flip side, where I do find optimism is that the silver lining of the middle class being unable to fully appreciate the tremendous amount of violence and power that's encoded into these algorithms is that the people on the bottom, the single parent who's going through the shelter system, who got 4 kids, who's now staying home from COVID because she knows that if she got Medicaid, she might see a podiatrist if she gets COVID, and the school was never teaching them about their culture and people who look like them. If those people who really understand what it means to be an American are able to grasp this terminology and kind of get the starter pack to start entering into that conversation and start leading and co-producing knowledge and co-producing new technical systems and co-producing a movement, I think that we could be in a tremendously different place. Algorithms, it's like in this moment, the most progressive thing I can say is refuse this system, refuse this algorithm, that you have the right to say no. But algorithms, like any other tool, are not inherently negative. I'm also Jewish, so In the Talmud, they say that, you know, with a knife, you can stab and murder someone. And with a knife, it can also be a scalpel and you can do like life-saving heart surgery. And so I'm not a Luddite, I'm not anti-technology. There are decisions that could be automated that we see within the realm of like public, maybe not public health, but like EEGs and, virology labs and things like that. There's ways that this can be, implemented to benefit all of us. Like life not need be this way. And I think that a lot of the inertia is a sense of resignation. And I know that people are overwhelmed right now by the multiple pandemics of COVID and state violence. But I think that we also can appreciate how despite everything, we're still here. It's a miracle. Like, why am I not utterly and totally hopeless? Like, because I woke up today and I got 5 kids and I swear their teachers think that it's like feed the children, but no, we ain't here in a 4-bedroom Brooklyn brownstone because rent's dropped. So, I mean, some things play out well. And I think that there's reason to be hopeful, but there are no heroes. It's us.
Thank you. Well said. And I'll leave the last word to Kevin. Kevin, are you optimistic? What do you see the future to be?
I'm sort of in a similar place, but I think, if things sort of continue as they are, we are well and truly screwed. I think there needs to be a very public reckoning around many of these systems. I actually think that a lot of these systems should not currently be in use, at least not until we can study and rethink and determine the racial and economic implications of these systems. And there needs to be, a lot more robust pipeline in place around the development of these systems, around accountability, and making sure that the organizations that are using this technology are held accountable for the social impacts and inequalities that they're creating. I don't see any of that happening right now. Maybe in the next decade, this will be something that people will start to take notice of. I am hopeful that we are in a spot similar to where the climate movement used to be, where it used to be a bunch of people screaming at legislators, and now it has become a whole movement. And my hope is that a similar sort of reckoning will happen around algorithms and around the use of technology. But as things are now, I am not very optimistic. Sorry to end on a down note.
It's quite all right. I do appreciate all of your sentiments here. It sounds like, and any of you can correct me if I'm wrong, we do have our work cut out for us, especially in the next few years here. It sounds like we need to educate ourselves, like you all said. We need to organize, and we need to hold our city council and our legislators accountable to make sure that they are asking these questions, asking for this information, and making sure we hold these monopolies, which many of them are, to be transparent in what they are actually doing with these algorithms and where they're getting this information from and what they're doing with this information and how they're implementing it. So I want to thank all my panelists tonight. Judge Melissa Crane, Kevin Way, Ms. Khadija Abdul-Raham. I want to thank you all. Please check out Ms. Abdul-Raham, all the resources that she posted in the group chat here if you haven't. Digital Defense Playbook, Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, among many others. Please look for the Loomis decision from the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which is very, very helpful. Also, Machine Bias, the investigation done by ProPublica. And I'm going to plug a book that I just read, Weapons of Math Destruction. That's right, Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill. Very informative book. Talks a lot about algorithms and how they're used in various different fields. So please check out all the resources that we have. They're extremely helpful. We have to educate ourselves. We have to organize ourselves. And we have to push back against these algorithms that are biased against a lot of us. They can be used for better, but we have to make sure that we demand that they are better. So thank you all again for this evening. Thank you for joining the West Harlem Progressive Democratic Club, as well as West Harlem Community. Tune in next time for our next event, which will be the next forum for the Comptroller's Office race. That's on December 29th. Please stay tuned for an email on that. And thank you all again, all my panelists for joining. Appreciate it. Please stay well and healthy.
Sean, thank you so much for moderating. And if I can just add one more resource,
Absolutely.
Data and Society has a report that was fairly recent that came out called Poverty Logarithms. It's algorithms.logarithms, LAW. And it's a couple hundred pages long, but it's a fairly detailed accounting of all of basically any algorithmic system that you can think of and how their systems are perpetuating inequality in the status quo.
So I just posted that in the group chat. Hopefully I spelled it correctly there, but Data and Society Report, please check that out. Poverty Logarithms.
Logarithm, like legal.
There you go. Thank you. Poverty Logarithms. Thank you for that, Barry. I appreciate it. And if there's any other resources, Judge Crane, Ms. Abdulrahman, or Kevin, please send them my way and I'll be sure to disseminate them to everyone. Thank you again, everyone. Please be safe during this holiday season. Enjoy the time with you and your loved ones, and we will see you next time.
And before everybody goes, I just want to make one more thank you for someone who just did an amazing amount of work while none of us were paying attention. It's Andres Orejuela, who is running Spanish interpretation channel for this. So everything that this panel just had was in English and in Spanish. And I want to really encourage everybody to, we'll be posting links to the videos in English and in Spanish on our website and our Facebook. You know, I want to encourage everyone to not only have attended this, but share this with people in the community who are ultimately going to have their lives impacted by these algorithms, right? It's great that we're all here tonight, but part of the beauty of doing this over Zoom is that this knowledge can be shared much more easily, and people can watch this when they have a free moment. They can watch it in English and Spanish, and we'll be making efforts to try to increase education around this, because those same people that are going to be coming to the club for our endorsement for things like city council and next year for the state legislative races are the same people who are going to be ultimately incumbent upon them to make decisions about the legal framework for this in terms of statute. And so there needs to be a movement built and people educated on the ground, and then also people seeking to become legislators need to know that there is a movement that will hold them accountable on these.
Well said. I think we end on that note. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I got it in.